Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh my God, I'm always on it to see you. Um,
Right on.
yeah. So a couple things. I definitely keep it to an hour or less. Uh, and two, I listen to a lot of your podcasts, and I definitely have my questions ready. But I want to ask you, is there anything out of all the interviews you did that you want to talk about?
Uh, well, I'm always interested in talking about my stuff I haven't done because somebody might hear it and give me some ideas.
Go ahead, shoot. It's all yours.
Okay. So I'm about to publish this book on slavery, the slave trade, and the roots of U.S. imperialism, North Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, West Asia, Ottoman-Turkey, Russia, and Western Europe. Now, it deals a lot, as the title suggests, with the slave trade heading north and east, north to North Africa, Egypt having one of the most significant slave markets in the 19th century, and also the fact that a major slave market was in Mecca, of all places. And as well, that in addition to what I've written about previously concerning the role of abolitionist London in suppressing the slave trade, in this particular iteration of the slave trade, Russia plays a major role. And in some ways, this slave trade heading north and east, in some ways, is more significant than the slave trade heading across the Atlantic. Obviously, the role of Russia comes into play with regard to Ethiopia beating back the Italian invasion of the 1890s. Ethiopia historically was seen as a major source for enslaved Africans precisely because it was not colonized and therefore made it, in a sense, more vulnerable. After that, I'm going to publish this book on the counter-revolution of 1858. This relates to my stay in British Columbia last year, and it deals with a lot with Native American history. That is to say, the Cayuse, the Palouse, the Walla Walla. It deals with the fearsome Northern Indians, as they were called, who would sail in on huge boats, 80 warriors per boat, and plunder and pillage what is now Seattle in the 1850s, for example. It's a complicated story because it not only involves the Euro-Americans, it involves up until what, 1848, the Mexicans in California, the Russian River in Northern California, still holding that name, suggests the projections of Russia from Northern California up to Alaska, which it controls in 1867. Then, of course, there are the British and what is now British Columbia. Folks should reflect on the fact that the founding father of British Columbia was a man of African descent. Speaking of Sir James Douglas, just as I talk about in my book on Haiti, the major British representative in Haiti in the 1820s was a man of African descent, Charles Mackenzie. And obviously, the US patriots should wonder how and why it was the so-called Revolutionary Republic could not imagine a man of African descent playing such a prominent role in their republic, their so-called Revolutionary Republic during the same time. And this is also a critique of settler colonialism because what happens fundamentally is that the Hudson Bay Company, which intriguingly just went out of business a year or so ago, bought up by a Chinese billionaire, that it disdained settlers because it complicated its business model of trade in furs and timber with the indigenous. But it was forced into that practice because of the flood of Euro Americans from across the border in what is now the state of Washington. And another part of the story is the fact that in 1858, the Black community of San Francisco moves in mass to British Columbia, attracted by Sir James Douglas, just as in the state of Oregon, there were statutes forbidding the arrival of Black people, which is one of the reasons why Portland is probably the most significant urban node without a significant Black population. I could go on in that vein, but the next book is on the long detour, the Sino-Soviet split and the rise and fall of U.S. imperialism. As the title suggests, it's rather self-explanatory. It deals with the Chinese Revolution from 1949, although I'm going to conclude with the Clinton administration and its pushing through most favored nation status with China, which accelerates trade between the two countries across the Pacific. The Carter administration plays a pivotal role, and this illustrates one of my themes, insofar as Leonard Woodcock, who had been the leader of the United Auto Workers, was ambassador to China at a time when the breakthrough in trade took place. And it's rather ironic that his state of Michigan and the other parts of the industrial Midwest see themselves as being victimized by the China trade deal, even though a leader of the United Auto Workers helped to engineer it. I just returned from the Clinton Library, and the story I'm going to have to explore is the flood of Chinese money that's coming across the Pacific, and not least to the Democratic National Committee, which is a major issue in the 1990s, by the way. Another issue I'm going to deal with is Maoism, which had a particular attraction in the US left. One of my major characters in this book, whose name I won't mention because he's still in the land of the living and still litigious, was not only a Maoist, he was a US intelligence agent and was also the literary agent of a number of leading Black power figures who I'll talk about in the book. Then I'm going to write a book on Mississippi slavery. It's going to be a lot of Native American history once again in this book, particularly the history of the Choctaw, for example. One of their leaders, Greenwood LaFleur, was also an enslaver. And in fact, in my book on armed struggle, I talk about the lawyer for Angela Davis was a direct descendant of Greenwood LaFleur, although, of course, he was defined as Black, not as indigenous. And I'm working on a book on the Leo Frank case. This is the case from 110 years ago of this Jewish factory manager in Georgia who is lynched after allegations of supposedly molesting a young Euro-American Christian girl. He blames the Black janitor. The lynchers do not believe him. They believe the Black janitor who points the finger at Leo Frank, and they lynch Leo Frank, which many people find fascinating, as do I. And then I'm going to do a book on another 1776 book. This deals with British Florida. St. Augustine, Florida, was part of the British Empire as a result of a defeat of the Spanish in the run-up to 1776. But it does not join the 13 colonies. It's one of those dogs that didn't bark stories. And particularly concerning East Florida, which is today's Florida, I posit that it was the role of Negroes in St. Augustine, the earliest urban node in what is now the United States, started by the Spanish in 1565, that the Negroes who were armed were hostile to the settlers, and which then, of course, jeopardized the role of Georgia, which was well on its way to becoming a major slave emporium. So anyway, those are the projects that I'm working on. I think that's it. But if anybody has any suggestions, please email me.
Oh, I'll definitely email you. But let's go back to the first one. Why don't you share a little bit more about the Native American influence in the Northwest, as in relation
Oh,
to
yeah.
the book?
Well, as I said, there were first some warriors. Not only, I should have mentioned in that brief summary that the US at that point styled itself as a kind of Protestant project. And anti-Catholicism was very significant, to put it mildly, up to and including the burning down of convents in northeastern cities. And it was thought by the Protestant settlers that the Catholics in that part of North America were aiding the Native Americans. In fact, here's a project that I probably won't be able to pursue, but I throw it out to anybody else who wants to pursue it. Somebody needs to go, the Vatican has very good archives, and somebody needs to go to the Vatican
Mhm.
and examine their conflicts with the Protestants in North America in the context of anti-slavery. There is work on the Jesuits and their conflict with the Protestants in the context of preventing anti-indigenous depredations, for example. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons, also were accused of aiding the indigenous as well. And I think one of the reasons we study history is because things change.
Mhm.
When you think of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, understandably, you think of conservatism. You think of the fact that they're disproportionately cited in the Central Intelligence Agency, for example, because as Mitt Romney showed, they oftentimes have a facility with languages because of their missionizing. Mitt Romney, of course, was fluent in French. But in the 19th century, they were accused of aiding the indigenous against the settlers. In fact, very serious charges. I mean, some of this has been written about. Your audience should look up the Mountain Meadow Massacre, for example, which in some ways is the kind of a replay of the Boston Tea Party, where you recall that the settlers, some of them disguised themselves as Native Americans in order to attack London. And the Mountain Meadow Massacre, the Mormons sought to suggest that it was the indigenous who were attacking the settlers, for example. So that's part of the story as well. And as I said, the movement of Black San Franciscans due north to British Columbia is a major part of the story. And you might want to cross-reference the Danny Glover and Jonathan Major vehicle, The Last Black Man in San Francisco,
Okay.
which in part deals with this dearth of Black people in San Francisco, which you can make an argument that the dearth stretches back to the mid-19th century when they all fled persecution and harassment for voluntary exile in British Columbia.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I've heard a lot about racism in Portland. I didn't know that there was a point where they had said no blacks allowed, but I've
No,
heard of a lot of recent destruction.
no Negroes allowed. And also, I mentioned this actually in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, as
Mhm.
well, which came out more than a decade ago, because part of their rationale, part of the settlers' rationale, was that the Negroes would ally with the indigenous. And the settlers already had their hands full of fighting the Cayuse, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, etc.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they felt that allowing Negroes would just bulwark the ranks of the indigenous. And they pointed to Florida. Recall that also, with regard to fierce indigenous resistance, comes from the Sunshine State. That is to say,
mhm,
the people we refer to as the Seminoles, for example, they had an interlocking directorate with Black people. And the Dade Massacre, D-A-D-E massacre, is still taught in Florida schools. At least I assume it's taught in Florida schools, not least since the man for whom it's named, he bequeathed his name to the county that includes Miami, the major population center of the Sunshine State. And so these Euro-Oregonians felt that there would be a replay
mhm.
in Oregon. That is to say, the Negroes aligning with the Native Americans against the settlers. Ultimately, the Negro settler, excuse me, Negro Indigenous Alliance was ousted altogether. Many of them were forced to move into Mexico
Wow,
and into South Texas, for example.
wow, wow. Your next book, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. your next book, you talked about slavery, and you mentioned Russia, and I wanted to
Hmm.
give me some, share some more information about that.
Yeah, well, so the Ottoman Turks, as you know, they meet their Waterloo at the end of World War I, 1918, 1919, which leads to the decomposition uh, of Ottoman-Turkey and the rise of Kemal Ataturk and the changing of the alphabet, the changing of dress, etc. As you may recall, there are those like the late Osama bin Laden who wanted to reenact the caliphate, this idea of Muslim rule, because the Ottomans, they ruled a good deal of Egypt, a good deal of North Africa, a good deal of the Arabian Peninsula, for example. And the Ottomans were equal opportunity enslavers. They enslaved Black people, they enslaved Southeastern Europeans, for example. Just as a footnote, I just spoke on my Around the Horn broadcast about the Bulgarian election. And I mentioned in that context how a so-called pro-Russian candidate prevailed. And I mentioned how one of the marvels of the Cold War was the turning of many of these Southeastern Europeans against Russia since in the 19th century and before, the Russians were their guardians against the lances from the Ottoman Turks, who oftentimes would enslave them. And the Ottoman Turks also enslaved Russians as well. And this gave Russia a material incentive to oppose slavery. I mentioned in this book that's forthcoming in a few months that as early as, say, 1818, 1819, Russia was executing slave dealers, for example, at a time when slave dealers were coddled, if not celebrated, in the so-called Revolutionary Republic, for example. And then many of your audience are already familiar with Pushkin. By the way, there's a statue to Pushkin in Washington, D.C., on the George Washington University campus.
Okay.
I took a picture next to that statue that's on my Facebook page, as I recall. And Pushkin, of course, was a man of African descent, seen as the father of the Russian language. And drawing an analogy between how during the Cold War, at least by 1989, the US was able to turn many Bulgarians against Russia, even though they had been their protectors. In my Negro Comrades of the Crown book, I mentioned how a US diplomat in Jamaica in the 1840s, after emancipation in the 1830s, said that strategically it's important for the US to convince the Black population everybody hates them because then they would be less prone to making alliances, for example, against the interests of the United States. And basically, in a sense, that's worked because, and I think it has something to do with the fact that anti-Blackness is so pervasive in this country that I'm afraid to say that when many migrants come to this country, they pick up on that. It's hard to ignore. And so that becomes part of becoming a US national. And then Black Americans assume that even in their homelands, that people hate them. Even though in some of these people's homelands, they don't they don't they don't necessarily hate not only not necessarily hate Black Americans, they may not even know about the full dimensions of our existence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I point out, as I said, the role of Russia in rescuing Ethiopia in the 1890s, arming them to the teeth, by the way. And in part, this is not only anti-slavery solidarity, because, as I said, Ethiopia, Abyssinia was seen as a target for enslavers, but also Christian solidarity, for example, because you had a Christian elite in Addis Ababa, for example. And the book begins in the 1870s with a dramatic episode where Confederates who had migrated to Egypt, which was still enmeshed up to its eyeballs in enslaving, particularly raiding Sudan, for example, that these Confederates were tasked by Cairo to lead an invasion into Ethiopia, to turn Ethiopia into a happy hunting ground for enslavers. And this raises a number of questions. One, uh, I make a critique of some of our sainted abolitionist leaders, including Douglas, for inattention to the slavery question after 1865. It's almost as if after 1865, it's no longer an issue. But I think that's part of the process of becoming a U.S. national. And you can extend that to today, for example. As I've mentioned more than once, in the Compromise of 1954, the trade-off was throwing internationalist Black leaders like Robeson overboard in return for sticking to our domestic knitting. That deal has expired. The people, they take the Keith Sweat approach, make it last forever. They don't want to acknowledge that that deal is expired.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know that it's really shocking how little many of our contemporary Black intellectuals know about what's going on in the world. Or alternatively, to raise another point, how they're generally absent from many of these podcasts about the war, which is not only a product of them not speaking out, it's also a product of white supremacy. Because there are many of us who are conversant, but you would never know it because they ignore us. So in other words, the so-called left-wing podcasters are adherent to the bargain too,
Yep.
although
Yep.
they would be loath to admit it,
Yep.
so to speak.
Yep.
So these are some of the issues that I'm currently grappling with.
Well, I wanted you segue into my area of interest. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
interested in all of it, and a lot of what you shared. I'm looking forward to your upcoming books because the you're just even in this conversation, you enlighten me to a lot of things, especially in the Northwest that I just wasn't familiar with, but totally makes sense. Um, but I wanted to pick up what you said. I wanted to know, given the war, given that the war in Iran, given that the United States is now entering a multipolar world,
Mhm.
what about Haiti? No one's
Mhm.
talking about Haiti. What about the African Americans in this country? What about the African people of descent in South America? And what
Mhm.
about Africa itself? Nobody's talking about the repercussions of the New World Order and how it's impacting us globally. And I wanted to know your thoughts about that.
Well, I've talked about it a bit on various programs, but let me elaborate. One, the crisis in Lebanon will have tremendous knock-on effects in Haiti and in West Africa, particularly Cote d'Ivoire. Because if you look at the political economy of those two regions, you'll quickly note that there's a immigrant Lebanese population that's sort of a comprador bourgeoisie in Haiti, Cote d'Ivoire, and actually a good deal of West Africa. So with the crisis in Lebanon, with Israeli depredations, basically seeking to oust people from southern Lebanon, turning them into homeless, uh, inevitably there will be an influx into West Africa and into Haiti. And Haiti, of course, can hardly withstand any additions to its present crisis. This is obviously an outgrowth of the war. Also, an outgrowth of the war is what the Wall Street Journal reported the other day, which is that U.S. is trying to improve relations with Eritrea, for example, which is routinely denounced in the U.S. press. Eritrea, recall, a former province of Ethiopia, Abyssinia. In fact, Eritrea plays a major role in this book I just mentioned, because being on the Red Sea, it was targeted not only by the Ottoman Turks, but by the Egyptians. And when Portugal was in its heyday, it was targeted by the Portuguese as well. But now in 2026, Eritrea is seen still geographically as strategic. It's not far distant from Somaliland, a breakaway province from the larger Somalia, which Israel has just recognized and apparently is encouraging the United States to act similarly. And I dare say that this warming up relations between Eritrea and the United States may be leading in that direction. But the major point is that it's abutting the Red Sea, and across the Red Sea is Yemen, Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis, as they're referred to, uh, who fought the United States in the early months of the Trump administration before Trump turned tail and fled, concluding that these were tough hombres, which they are. And with Ansar Allah being allied with the Iranians, you can expect the Red Sea to be heating up sooner rather than later. And this will have ramifications in the region, because even before this warming of relations with Eritrea and Washington, what was developing was a de facto alliance between Egypt and Eritrea against Ethiopia. Egypt is very concerned about Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam, which it feels jeopardizes its lifeblood, speaking of the Nile River. And in fact, on tape, somehow there are statements from the highest levels in Cairo about destabilizing Ethiopia because of the Grand Renaissance Dam and allied issues, not to mention the fact that the conflict stretches back quite a while. I reference what I just said about 1875 and Cairo seeking to enslave Abyssinians, Ethiopians. And then those of us who are familiar with what is referred to as ancient history can go back centuries and detail the conflict between Abyssinia and Egypt. And then, of course, another knock-on effect is the role of the United Arab Emirates, which is going to have to rethink its entire business model. Speaking of Abu Dhabi and Dubai in particular, which have become not only a sort of sunny site for shady people, crypto, finagling, money laundering, gigantic hotels, for example, many of which I understand are quite empty, understandably. But the UAE has become sort of an Israeli front. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with this incessant interference in the internal affairs of African states, particularly Sudan, where the UAE is charged with supporting a faction in the conflict between the Sudanese military and the wing of the military, the Rapid Support Forces. UAE is charged with supporting the latter. Sudan is probably the bleeding sore in terms of human rights violations today on planet Earth. And the question becomes, as UAE rethinks its whole model of development, what will be the impact on Sudan? Then, of course, many of the Gulf Arab individuals, if not states, are charged with interfering in the affairs of the Sahel, for example, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which is quite alarming and quite disturbing.
Can you say more about that?
Well, just in the last 24 hours, there have been reports about these religious zealots, so-called Islamic fundamentalists, uh, who have been on the outskirts of Bamako, the capital of Mali, for example. Supposedly they killed the defense minister, which is quite concerning. There are similar reports emerging from Burkina Faso, for example, as well. And Ibrahim Traore, I'm happy to say, has been touted as sort of a modern day version of Che Guevara, for example, following the footsteps of the late Thomas Sankara. And both Ouagadougou and Bamako charged that France is behind these religious zealots.
That's what I would think. Sure.
I'll put that statement out there. Others charge that it's the Gulf monarchs or individuals from the Gulf monarchies that are behind this. And then, of course, with regard to the crisis in the Straits of Hormuz and its impact on energy supplies. This heightens the importance of African oil, Nigeria, Gabon, for example, Angola, uh, natural gas from Algeria, for example. There's energy exploration off the coast of Mozambique, where Rwandan troops have been dispatched to beat back, once again, religious zealots, for example. So Africa is wholly and totally caught up in this present crisis, a crisis, by the way, that I do feel will lead to a diminished status for US imperialism, not only because of how it's impacted NATO with Mr. Trump's attacks on Sir Keir Starmer in London and Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain, for example. Just a few days ago, the Prime Minister in Spain had this important gathering in Barcelona with Mr. Lula da Silva of Brazil as a co-chair. It was not billed as such, but it was basically an anti-US imperialist rally. Mia Mottley of Barbados, President Ramaphosa of South Africa were present, along with President Petro of Colombia. Interestingly enough, there was a companion meeting near the same time of the right and center right of Europe in Milan, because we need to recognize that there are some real fissures between the right and center right in Europe and their counterparts across the Atlantic, including the Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany Party,
Wow.
which it's whether people know it or not, our political tasks are becoming ever more complicated with every passing day. For example, there's this Back to the Future scenario unfolding in Germany as we speak, with Berlin bulking up its military.
Yep.
In part, this is a reaction to the blows inflicted on this auto industry by China. So they're shifting, in a sense, to arms production. But the Back to the Future aspect is that echoes of Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans invaded Russia and leading to a global catastrophe.
Yep.
And obviously, this flows, in a sense, out of the Ukraine crisis. It flows out of the disillusion in Berlin and a good deal of Europe with Mr. Trump, his attacks on NATO, and with his pulling the rug out from under Zelensky in Kiev. This is making our task ever more complicated. And likewise, speaking of ever more complicated, in his latest snit with London, the Trump regime, or at least elements within it, suggested that the United States should no longer recognize British sovereignty over the Falklands, the Malvinas off the coast of Argentina. Recall in 1982, under Thatcher, there was this war fought over the Falklands, leading to the erosion of influence of the military junta in Argentina. Argentina has not given up its claim. President Milei is now a comrade in arms of Mr. Trump. Now, this makes it complicated because, on the one hand, I think we should recognize that the Malvinas probably should be under Argentine jurisdiction. But on the other hand, giving a bouquet to President Milei is not something we should necessarily be supportive of, for example. Nor should we necessarily be supportive of British colonialism, the vestiges of same in the Malvinas. So this is what I mean about our task becoming ever more complicated.
Sure. And to that point of complication, how do you look at Russian and Chinese influence in Africa?
Well, as you know, I'm doing this. I'm thinking a lot about China now because that's one of my projects is U.S.-China relations. And I have to say, personally, I'm sort of, on the one hand, I want to tell this story, but on the other hand, I don't want to complicate. I don't want to inadvertently feed into a new Cold War with China. Because let's face it, I mean, the turning point for both US imperialism And China was the Nixon-Kissinger Entente of the early 1970s.
Mhm.
It was like a Hail Mary pass for US imperialism. They were on the back foot after the independence of, uh, with the growing independence movements in Angola and Mozambique, culminating in 1975, with Algerian independence in 1962, and with the Entente with China, it gave a sort of respite to US imperialism to a degree. As noted with my vignette about Leonard Woodcock, it gave a shot in the arm to the Chinese economy. So I don't want to complicate our political task. But on the other hand, I feel young people need to know how we got to this point. That's why I'm going to do the book, because actually old people too, because they may not be aware as well.
Yeah.
And that brings me to China in Africa. You don't find that much complaint amongst African leaders about the Chinese role. They see it as a counterweight to French imperialism, US imperialism, British imperialism. And then there's the curiosity that many in the United States who complain about Chinese influence in Africa, they don't have a mumbling word to say about Turkish influence in Africa, which is really strong. In Somalia, the aforementioned Somalia, the Turks are in charge of airport security, picking up the garbage. They have a spaceport there. They're doing oil exploration off the coast of Somalia. They're educating students in Ankara and Istanbul. In any African nation where you have a substantial Muslim population, which is a good deal, of West Africa, North Africa, to a degree, Northeastern Africa, you have Turkish influence, but nobody talks about it. At least I don't hear them talking about it. Not to mention Indian influence in the region stretching from Mombasa, Kenya, which has a substantial Indian diaspora community, down through Dar es Salaam and Durban, significant Indian investment and influence. We've already mentioned French influence in Cote d'Ivoire and Gabon, in the Sahel states, for example. So why should we be singling out China just because it's a foe of US imperialism? I mean, that doesn't sound like a principled position to me. And similarly, Russia is viewed as a counterweight. And then Russia has a bit of prestige from the Soviet days when it was arming liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa itself. Uh, Not to mention altering the correlation of forces beginning in 1917. That's actually in the forthcoming book. I talk a bit about that because given what I've already said about this relationship between pre-1917 Russia and Ethiopia, what happens is that after 1917, Russia, which already had a strong position in Addis Ababa, reinforces that position to the consternation of the British in Kenya, the
Mhm.
French in Djibouti, the Italians in Somalia, for example. And that leads, of course, to Addis Ababa, even under His Imperial Majesty, we know as Haile Selassie, not necessarily disrupting that relation. Although, as I point out in my China book, uh, during the US Korean War, 1950 to 1953, which was fought under the banner of the United Nations for various reasons, the Ethiopians contributed troops to the US side to fight the North Koreans and the Koreans and the Chinese, for example. And His Imperial Majesty made this trip to Washington during that time. And I should also mention, in terms of inattention, in that same book, in terms of how some of the folks in West Asia have not been able to get over enslaving. When Saudi leaders come to Washington in the 1950s, they're accompanied by enslaved Africans, by the way. This is what I mean about uh, this compromise that's made with regard to not paying attention to global affairs and sticking to your domestic knitting, which only allows regressive forces to gain momentum globally, which then has backlash on these shores.
Yeah.
But to come back to the thread, uh, I think that there is a kind of new Cold War erupting in Africa, but like the old Cold War, it's due in part to objection to Africans aligning with China and Russia, or Africans seeking to avoid the historic fate of being sort of a source of plunder and pillage on the part of the North Atlantic powers.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. We can go in so many different directions. Yeah, we got about maybe 15 minutes left. I just wanted, can you say more about, and I sort of bring this up as a habit, but what can Africans Americans do? One of the things I'm hearing is that we need to become more internationalized, at least
Mm-hmm.
become more aware of what's going on in the world. Is there anything else we need to do, or is there a way that we can do that you haven't seen?
Well, we need to bulwark our organizations in that vein. I was happy to see that President Ramaphosa, and I think President Petro as well, came to the funeral of Jesse Jackson in Chicago,
Mhm.
because I think one of the strategic blunders on both sides of the Atlantic took place post 1994, when we had Trans-Africa, which was this Black American lobby,
Yeah.
played a pivotal role during the anti-apartheid struggle. It tended to go into liquidation post 1994.
Hmm.
And then I think the South Africans could have done more to help Trans-Africa. But now, Mr. Trump obviously has South Africa in the crosshairs because of its alignment with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's bringing the case of the International Court of Justice, charging Israel plausibly with genocide against the Palestinians.
Yep. Yep.
Mr. Trump has objected to President Ramaphosa being invited to the G7 meeting in France. France capitulated. He's not been invited to the G20 meeting in the
Mhm.
United States, for example. And then I think, as a sort of capitulation, if I may use that term, President Ramaphosa appointed a new ambassador who we negotiated with pre 1994, speaking of Rolf Meyer, concerning the dissolution of apartheid. Then Meyer joined the ANC. Of course, he's of European ancestry, and so it's felt that that'll mollify Mr. Trump. And you see, that this is what I mean. I mean, where is the objection coming from the Black community, from the left community?
Yeah.
I mean, South Africa has to bend the knee on white supremacist grounds. You would think in the United States, many people on the left are not even aware, because you just like I was saying, how so many Black people, they're so unaware of what's going on in the world. So many of our friends on the left, they're totally unaware of what's going on in Africa.
Yeah.
It's still the so-called dark continent as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
And then they don't factor this in. You can't really have a global analysis unless you're taking account of all parts of the globe.
That's right.
And so obviously there's a big hole in their analysis. So I would say that bulwarking our organizations, and fatefully it was NAACP, which was first in line to accept the Faustian bargain of distancing itself from global affairs.
Yeah.
The NAACP, which has branches in virtually every US village and city,
Hmm.
needs to be encouraged to abandon that bankrupt line, which would call for a sort of seeking to get involved in the organization and turning it around. And of course, a revival of Trans-Africa would be wholly in line. And then I think that this legion of podcasters who I think are having impact and effect. I won't mention any names because I might forget some, to my consternation. But I think that they're having significant impact on the war and the course of the war in Iran. I think they're having a significant impact on the declining fortunes of CNN, for example, because there's only so many hours in the day if you're tuning into left-wing podcasters, you're not tuning into MSNL or CNN.
Right.
And so our left-wing podcasters need to pay more attention to Africa. And then in that context, they may even find it necessary to invite on more melanin-rich speakers, for
Yep.
example,
Yep.
which would be a plus for them, for example. Although you never know that somehow they still might manage to avoid that entire category. So there's much. I've since living in Canada last year. One of the points I've been mentioning is that there needs to be more trans-border
Mhm.
relationships. I mean, for example, in British Columbia, the Social Democrats have been in power for years now. They rule British Columbia now, for example. And you have these social democratic outposts in New York City, for example. But I think that the bonding across borders and is a must. And likewise, you have organizations across the border who are much more influential in Ottawa than their peers in the United States or influential in Washington, D.C. We should take advantage of that, particularly since Canada is really going through a significant transformation in light of the rise of Trump, and his musing is about the 51st state, Canada's 51st state. There's even serious talk about Canada joining the European Union, believe it or not, and which would be highly significant, particularly given the fact that France is becoming rather hawkish with regard to U.S. and given France's influence in Quebec, still a major part of Canada, this could have serious ramifications for U.S.-Canada relations, for the global correlation of forces, etc. But until we get involved in these sorts of issues, it's almost as if they're not happening.
Yep. 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 Do you want to say we can part now? Do you want to say anything more about the white left?
Oh, God. Well, uh, not unless you have a specific question. I mean,
Well, I mean, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. I'm listening to the podcast, and they're very insightful
mhm,
in talking about everything north of the equator. You know what I
mhm,
mean?
mhm,
And thank God I'm seeing more progress in them understanding the relationship between organized crime, the Mossad, and the United States. So I think that that's great. But no matter what the through line is, whether it's American history or whether it's international history, you would think that Black people don't even exist.
mm. Which is a shame, given the fact of Black people in the United States being disproportionately pro-union,
Hmm.
being more prone to vote against the right wing,
Yep.
being less taken by class collaboration. I have
Yep.
a piece coming out in The Nation in the run-up to July 4th that talks about class collaboration being the great unmentionable
Yep.
amongst many of our friends on the left. It's almost like it doesn't exist when it's really part of the secret sauce
Yep.
of settler colonialism, of U.S. imperialism,
Yep.
etc.
Yep.
And as a matter of fact, in recent uh, broadcasts, I've been trying to see parallels be, between and amongst settler solidarity, class collaboration, and white supremacy, for example, which overlap to a certain degree, but also there are analytical distinctions between and amongst them, although they generally head in the same direction,
Hmm.
for example.
Yep.
And so obviously, in terms of getting our acts together, the US left needs to pay more attention to that triple-headed monster.
Yeah. I feel like they're like yeah, they're not into class collaboration. I mean, they're into class collaboration, and like right now, when you look at consumer spending, half of consumer spending is being done by 10% of the wealthiest people in the United States. but you would think that there would be more, more collision, but there's no mention of it. But I guess I would end with this because you've talked about this in the past in some of your books. What is the significance of African or Black American or, Blacks events in history that have shaped the world? You've mentioned Haiti, for example,
Mhm.
so if you can
Mhm.
say a little bit about that, because that sort of shows our influence in the world.
Well, for one, with regard to Haiti and with regard to Black America, I've tried to place both in the context of a class conversation, because basically we're talking about the unpaid sector of the working class, for
Yep.
example. And the unpaid sector of the working class then struggles for compensation, which then benefits the working class as a whole, for
Right.
example.
Yeah.
And in this upcoming book, I talk about the Zanj Revolt, spelled on our side of the Atlantic, Zanj, which takes place in what is now Basra, Iraq, at the end of the 9th century, a massive uprising of the enslaved, which lasts for 15 years. And once again, this is a tremendous victory for working people generally. Uh, Although, of course, it's not a stretch to suggest that it takes a while for its importance to be unraveled. So I think that these anti-colonial victories, particularly post 1917 with the Russian Revolution, are quite significant because to the extent that the exploitation of Africa declines, that means that the exploitation of labor also declines. And
Yeah.
so it has positive knock-on effects for the working class globally, for example, for working people globally, for those who have to sell their labor for a wage. And I am certain that this kind of analysis will gain traction uh, because right now, obviously, US imperialism is in crisis. It's losing altitude with every passing day as a result of this debacle in Iran. And there's nothing like a crisis to concentrate minds wonderfully and to lead to sharpened thinking as well.
Great. Well, let's end on that note. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good luck to you.
Until next time. Absolutely.
All right, bye-bye. Oh, don't forget to send me the link.
Absolutely. And you've been oh yeah, I'm going to do that. Absolutely.
Right on.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This statement is for our audience. In closing, I would like to thank you for joining us in the continuing journey through history, power, and liberation. Subscribe and remain with us in preparing for the challenges ahead. We hope you found value in listening to Professor Gerald Horne discuss his forthcoming work on the North African, West Asian slave trade roots of U.S. imperialism, a study that forces us to confront the buried architecture of empire, conquest, race, and human bondage beyond the narrow Atlantic framework imposed by Eurocentric interpretations of history. The colonized mind is sustained by historical amnesia. To reclaim consciousness, we must interrogate the foundations of empire wherever they exist. Leave your comments, criticism, questions, and ideas for future discussions below. Your participation is part of the intellectual work itself. More conversations with Professor Horne are coming soon, including discussions surrounding more of his upcoming work, examining slavery, settler colonialism, class collaboration, counter-revolution, capitalism, and the global making of white supremacy.
The concrete wears the stories of the feet that never rested. A social contract broken and a justice system tested. We're tracing lines in the dust where the giants used to stand, building up a blueprint for a long-awaited land. It's a rhythm in the marrow, it's a whisper in the wind. Knowing where the struggle stops and where the truths begin. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. The metaphor of shadows is the comfort of the blind, but we're breaking through the static of a cultivated mind. Every voice is a brushstroke on a canvas, painted colors of a different kind of day. Urgency is not a fire, it's a slow and steady flame, keeping us from forgetting why we ever started the game. So let the awareness rise like the tide against the shore. We aren't asking for a fragment, we are asking for the more. In the cadence of the collective, in the soul of the beat, we find the courage to stand up, even when we feel the heat, even when we feel the heat. Metaphor in motion, urgency in the air. Are you listening? Are you there? The rhythm remains, the reflection continues. Stay aware. Peace.